23,000 jobs now hanging in the balance.
Trump's trade push shakes Canada's industrial core.
Canada scrambles to save steel and pride.
Trump's new tariffs threaten Canada's backbone. The handshake is gone. The alliance that built North America's prosperity is cracking. Trump's tariffs didn't just target steel, they struck at Canada's spine. 15 billion Canadian dollars of steel production, 23,000 direct jobs, and 100,000 more indirect roles instantly entered a zone of uncertainty. From Windsor to Hamilton, furnaces are cooling, workers are waiting, and fear is spreading faster than the heat once did. This isn't trade negotiation anymore. It's economic warfare disguised as patriotism. And if Canada falls, the shock will roar straight back into America's own heartland. It began quietly, a White House meeting, a smile for the cameras, and then a signature that changed everything. Donald Trump, chasing pre-election victories, revived his old weapon, tariffs. Steel, aluminum, and energy, the lifeblood of Canada's industrial core. For decades, Canada and the United States moved as one economic body. The engines built in Windsor powered cars assembled in Detroit. The steel forged in Hamilton framed American skyscrapers. It was a relationship worth $1.3 trillion a year, a relationship of mutual dependence and shared growth. Until Washington decided to protect itself from its own friends. When Trump's team slapped new tariffs on foreign steel to protect U.S. industry, Canada was caught in the crossfire. 15 billion Canadian dollars of steel production, 23,000 direct jobs, and 100,000 more indirect roles instantly entered a zone of uncertainty. Melanie Joly, Canada's industry minister, stood in front of the press and said, "We'll fight for every single job because these are our jobs." It wasn't a speech for television, it was a plea for survival.
Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney flew to Washington with hopes of securing sectoral deals for steel, for aluminum, for energy before plants shut their doors. Inside the Oval Office, he spoke for 20 minutes alone with Trump. The meeting ended with smiles and handshakes, but when Carney returned to Ottawa, he brought no relief, only a promise that officials would work quickly to land deals. That was weeks ago. Furnaces still burn low, shipments still stalled at the border, and workers still wait for news that never comes. Catherine Cobden, head of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, warned that this is no longer a diplomatic issue. Quote, "If we don't act now, we lose our plants. Those plants are not just factories, they're the spine of Canadian communities. Every mill supports families, schools, local businesses. Once a blast furnace cools, you don't just turn it back on, you rebuild from ashes." Across the river in Detroit, workers watch too, because the border doesn't protect them from reality. A study by the Center for Automotive Research found that U.S. tariffs have already cost the American auto industry $150 billion since 2018. Tariffs meant to save U.S. manufacturing are driving up car prices, shrinking sales, and forcing production cuts on both sides of the border. It's a self-inflicted wound disguised as victory.
Drive through Windsor, Ontario today, and you'll see the story on faces, not paper. Families who once built engines for Ford now worry if they'll be building anything next year. The Unifor union rep, John Diagnolo, put it plainly, "If Carney makes a deal that sacrifices the auto industry, he'll be in a hell of a fight with us." This is not just economics, it's identity. Canada's industrial story is the story of middle-class stability, of communities built around factories that fed generations. Now those foundations are crumbling under decisions made miles away in Washington. And the politics behind it? They're as cold as the steel on Canada's factory floors. Trump's advisors see tariffs as symbols of strength, strong America, strong manufacturing, strong jobs. But in reality, every tax on Canadian steel feeds higher costs for American construction, for cars, for energy projects. It's a loop of pain that ends where it began, with the American consumer. But in politics, optics often outweigh outcomes. A photo of Trump signing a tariff order sells power. The slow burn of lost jobs does not. It's the oldest rule in populist economics. Protect today's narrative and let tomorrow take the hit. But tomorrow is arriving faster than anyone expected. The US-Canada trade relationship is more than a diplomatic gesture. It's an economic machine finely tuned over 100 years. Ford, GM, and Stellantis build cars across a border that functions like a shared assembly line. The 1965 Auto Pact once made sure that Canadian parts fed American production and vice versa. That cooperation was later reborn under USMCA, the trade deal that Trump himself touted as the best in the world. Now, he's putting that very deal to the test. Every new tariff adds friction to a machine built on seamless movement. Canadian steelmakers pay more to ship, automakers pay more for inputs, consumers pay more for cars, and inflation, already stubborn, finds a new fuel source. Ottawa responded with anti-dumping measures against China, an attempt to prove that Canada is not the enemy but a partner facing the same threat. Still, Trump's strategy is clear. Make it in America, buy it in America, vote for America. Canada is collateral damage in a political storyline meant to secure headlines before midterms. Look beyond the economics and you see something deeper, a psychological break. For generations, Canada and the United States have been partners in identity as much as in trade. Shared language, shared values, shared defense. Now, one side talks about winning and the other talks about surviving. Trump's comment at the White House was casual but cutting. It's a tough situation because we want to make our cars here. That one sentence sent shockwaves through Canada's industrial corridors. Translation, we don't need you anymore.
But history says otherwise. Every major boom in the American auto sector was fueled by cross-border supply chains. Every steel shortage in the US was filled by Canadian mills. You can't unravel a century of integration without tearing through both economies. Yet politics rarely listens to logic. It listens to cheers. And for now, the crowd cheers for tariffs. Canada is now racing against time. Talks continue behind closed doors. Industry leaders lobby, unions protest. Ottawa weighs concessions that might save plants but cost political dignity. Because in this fight, the price of relief could be national pride itself. Now, coming next, dives into what happens if those deals fail, the economic shock forecast for 2025, how US consumers may end up paying the same bill they cheered for, and why this trade war might reshape the very idea of North American unity. Because when allies turn into competitors, the real cost isn't measured in tariffs, it's measured in trust. The headlines show one thing, tariffs, but beneath those numbers lies a deeper tremor. A shift in how nations trust, trade, and survive together. Canada's $1.3 trillion trade link with the United States isn't just an economic channel. It's the backbone of North American stability. Break it, and the shock ripples through everything: supply chains, energy prices, even food shelves. When Trump reignited his tariff campaign, global markets reacted instantly. The Canadian dollar slipped against the US dollar. Steel futures fell. Investment confidence, already fragile, began to wobble. Because investors don't flee from policy, they flee from unpredictability. And Washington's strategy looked increasingly unpredictable.
Here's what the data already shows. Since the US imposed the last round of steel tariffs in 2018, North American car prices jumped nearly 10%. The Center for Automotive Research estimates that continued tariffs could push that increase past 25% by 2025. That's the equivalent of an extra $8,000 on the average new car. Now imagine those costs rippling through every layer of the economy: logistics, construction, retail. It's not just metal that becomes expensive, it's life. For Canadians, it's existential. The country's industrial towns, Windsor, Hamilton, Sault Ste. Marie, were built on the rhythm of factory shifts and steel shipments. When those shifts slow, so does the heartbeat of entire communities. The local diner closes, the mechanic downsizes, the mortgage goes unpaid. And yet, for Washington, this is leverage, the kind of economic pressure that forces quick deals. But leverage cuts both ways. Canada supplies the raw material for America's defense industry, the same steel that builds tanks, ships, and fighter jets. Choke that flow, and the next national security crisis doesn't come from an enemy, it comes from a shortage. Trump's calculation is brutally simple. He wants visible wins before the 2025 midterms. Tariffs look like wins. They're easy to announce, hard to trace, and emotionally satisfying to a voter who feels ignored. We're bringing jobs back sounds cleaner than we're raising car prices. But on the northern side of the border, the politics are equally ruthless. Prime Minister Mark Carney can't afford to appear weak, not with unions threatening strikes and voters demanding protection. Canada's ministers, led by Melanie Joly and Dominic LeBlanc, are pushing emergency sectoral deals, temporary truces designed to protect specific industries from total collapse.
Analysts at the University of Toronto estimate that even a limited deal saving 20% of steel exports could preserve 5,000 direct jobs. But that would still leave nearly 18,000 families facing uncertainty. Every signature delayed means another plant edges closer to shutdown. Steel isn't the only target. Energy is next. Canada's vast oil sands and hydro exports have long balanced America's energy equation, but Trump's advisors are now pushing for an energy independence surge, a plan that would tax cross-border energy inputs to boost domestic drilling. That could cut billions from Canada's revenue streams and spark a tit-for-tat escalation. Ottawa would retaliate with tariffs on American LNG or agricultural imports. Suddenly, it's not just steel and cars, it's food and fuel. This isn't speculation. In 2023, during a smaller tariff dispute, Canada's countermeasures cost the U.S. dairy sector an estimated $240 million in lost sales. Multiply that across every retaliatory category, and you get a full-scale economic Cold War between two nations separated by nothing but a border sign that reads, "Welcome to Canada."
Inside the blast furnaces of Hamilton, workers talk less about politics and more about fear. Will my shift still exist next month? Will my pension still pay out? Will my kids' college plans survive? Uniform, the powerful Canadian labor union, reports that every 1,000 jobs lost in manufacturing erases 3,000 more in the service economy. That's 69,000 lives disrupted if this tariff standoff hardens. Across the border, American unions are split. Some see Trump's policies as protection, others see them as poison. The AFL-CIO quietly warned that new tariffs could backfire, wiping out 35,000 auto-related jobs in the Midwest. It's a trade war without winners, fought between factories that once shared blueprints. The world is watching. The European Union has already hinted at revisiting its own tariff strategy if the US-Canada dispute widens. China, opportunistic as ever, is courting Canadian resource companies cut off from American buyers. A crack between Washington and Ottawa becomes an opening for Beijing. Australia and the UK, long-standing allies, are urging calm, but they know what's at stake. If the North American partnership fractures, it sends a signal. Alliances can no longer shield economies from domestic politics. That's not just a Canadian problem, that's a global precedent. Economists call it ally fatigue, the moment when even friends begin hedging against friendship. And once that line is crossed, rebuilding trust is harder than restarting any furnace.
Let's talk hard numbers. See Canadian $15 billion, value of Canada's steel sector, 23,000 direct jobs in danger, 100,000 dependent livelihoods, $150 billion, estimated cost of U.S. auto tariff impact since 2018, $8,000 extra per car if tariffs continue. These are not statistics, they are shockwaves waiting for ignition. Moody's Analytics projects that a prolonged U.S.-Canada tariff standoff could shave 0.4% off U.S. GDP and 0.7% off Canada's. That's the equivalent of $180 billion in combined lost output, enough to fund every public school in both countries for a year. And yet, the political payoff remains irresistible, because in the short term, tariffs create the illusion of strength. They let leaders say, "We're protecting our people," even as those very people start losing paychecks. Behind closed doors, negotiators whisper about compromises, exemptions, temporary quotas, targeted reliefs. But the deeper issue isn't policy, it's pride. Canada refuses to kneel. The US refuses to blink. Diplomatic cables leaked last week suggest Canada is exploring joint pacts with Japan and South Korea to diversify export routes. That's survival strategy, but it's also a warning shot. If the United States can weaponize trade against its closest ally, no alliance is safe. Economist Robert Lighthizer, Trump's former trade chief, once said, "Economists have been wrong on everything." Maybe he's right, but when the math finally catches up with the politics, reality wins. Because here's the irony, the tariffs meant to protect the American worker may soon boomerang. Rising car prices cut sales. Lower sales mean layoffs. Layoffs mean anger, the same anger that fueled tariff politics in the first place. It's an economic Ouroboros, policy eating its own tail. In Michigan, auto dealers already report a 12% drop in new car orders since the latest tariff announcement. Construction firms in Ohio warn that steel shortages could delay projects worth billions. Protectionism is proving expensive and contagious. Three paths now lie ahead. Scenario 1, the quick fix. The US grants Canada partial relief to ease pressure before midterms. Plants reopen, politicians claim victory, but tariffs remain, ready to resurface at the next election. Scenario 2,
The Cold Trade War. Talks stall. Canada diversifies trade toward Asia and Europe. The US doubles down on domestic production. Both economies shrink. The alliance erodes. Scenario 3. The Rebuild. Public backlash in both countries forces a reset, a new continental strategy emphasizing co-production and resilience instead of rivalry. It's the only path that saves jobs and pride, but it requires what politics rarely allows: humility. History will remember this moment not for tariffs, but for trust. The US and Canada once showed the world that allies could compete without destroying each other. Now that lesson is fading. 23,000 Canadian workers still wait. $15 billion in industry still hangs by a thread, and one handshake, once symbolic of unity, now feels like history.
The furnaces can be reignited, the factories can be rebuilt, but faith, once cooled, takes generations to warm again. The next chapter of North America's story depends on a single question: will politics burn the bridge that built a continent, or will reason finally quench the fire? The clock is already ticking.